Ja, das ist blöd.
Der Ton am PC muss ausgeschaltet sein.
Wenn Sie unten rechts mal gucken.
Ja. Also ehrlich gesagt, mein Ton ist ausgeschaltet.
Hey, ich denke, da müssen wir es anders machen.
Also da ist ja völlig der Wurm drin. Mein Audio ist ausgeschaltet.
Herr Wiegand, Sie müssten auch den Eingang, das Mikro ausschalten.
Okay, das ist es. Ja, jetzt ist es ausgeschaltet, aber es ist immer noch dieses Geräusch.
Den Ausgang aus dem Computer ausschalten, also beide. Der Computer, den müssen Sie stumm schalten, den Computer.
Ja, ach so, okay.
Und sonst Ton ausgehen, dass Sie wieder aufnehmen.
So, nun.
Perfekt.
Fangen wir an.
Wunderbar, Herr Schlesinger, wir legen los.
Das Webinar läuft bereits. Das ist schon gestartet.
Ah, sehr schön.
Okay.
Arid, du beginnst.
Yeah, then let's start. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom and the Thomas Dehler Foundation to this online discussion called Global Europe, Global Expectations, EU Enlargement Scenarios for Southeast Europe and the countries of the Eastern Partnership. My name is Arid Demirci, and I'm Project Assistant in the Regional Office for East and Southeast Europe, based in Sofia, Bulgaria. The Russian war of aggression in Ukraine has put the European Union and the entire liberal international order at risk. Driven by the Putin regime, the cornerstones of this order, namely the recognition of the right of other states to exist, the exclusion of violence as an instrument of politics, respect for rules and decisions agreed among equals, the resolution of conflicts through compromise plus self-determination, common institutions, free trade, all these are being called into question today more than ever. Today, Moscow, but also Beijing, are betting on the collapse of the liberal order that has dominated since the end of the Cold War. Brexit, the Trump presidency, the slow but sure drift of some Western allies such as Hungary, Brazil, Turkey into authoritarian regimes strengthen Russia and China in their belief. Putin and Xi Jinping even promote this trend by spreading disinformation and fake news through their trolls, blackmailing states with economic instruments and strengthening them with violence, as in Ukraine and in Taiwan. All these developments demonstrate that the European Union's liberal order of democratic societies is at risk of losing its appeal in other world regions. In the new coordinate system of world politics, which is characterized by strategic competition between authoritarian states on the one hand and liberal democracies on the other, these are alarming signals. In order to defend and strengthen the European model of free and democratic societies against authoritarian regimes, the European Union project must regain its formative power, both within its borders and externally. To this end, the European Union must, on the one hand, demonstrate and exemplify internally that free and democratic societies are best suited to master major challenges, but on the other hand, the EU must strengthen its partnership with other countries and regions of the world and not leave them to other global players whose values are opposed to that of the European Union. Under the motto, Reshape Europe, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom took stock in 2022. through global activities related to the annual topic, we explored the question of what role the European Union plays in the world. How is the European Union perceived in other world regions? What are the expectations placed in the European Union? Based on these questions, initial recommendations for action were outlined in the Foundation-wide policy paper, Global Europe, Global Expectations, and it was discussed in the annual conference last year in October. Ms. Tamar Kekenadze, one of the speakers of today, was the author of the chapter on East and Southeast Europe, and she came up with very concrete policy proposals how the European Union should strengthen its relationship with Southeast Europe and the countries of the Eastern Partnership. Today, we will dive deeper into the discussion and talk about European Union enlargement scenarios for Southeast Europe and the countries of the Eastern Partnership. Without further ado, I now leave the floor to my colleague Konstantin Groth, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you so much and welcome again. Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aret. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to welcome you to our web talk. My name is Konstantin Groth. I am Program Executive for the Munich office of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and for the Thomas Dehler Foundation, which are also involved. I am very pleased that today we are discussing an exciting topic that is very, very important for Europe, namely the EU perspective of the countries of Southeast Europe, as well as Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And now I would like to introduce you to our speakers. I warmly welcome Tamar Kekenadze. She's the head of Advanced Research and Policy Development Institute at British University in Georgia, as well as a chair of the opposition party Free Democrats. Before joining the party in February 2015, she served as head of the civilian office of the Ministry of Defense of Georgia and at the Georgian Mission to NATO. And prior to that, she served as head of the Euro-Atlantic Integration Division at the Ministry of Defense of Georgia. Tamar Kekenadze also worked for 5 years in civil society organizations at national and international levels. She's currently pursuing her PhD in economics. In 2022, she published the article on Southeast and East Europe in a publication of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, Global Europe, Global Expectations. Aret talked about it. A warm welcome also to Dr. Christian Hagemann. He is Executive Director of the Southeast Europe Association, Südosteuropa Gesellschaft here in Munich. In his capacity, he is regularly involved in the organization of international conferences and workshops dealing with developments in Southeast Europe. Christian Hagemann holds a PhD in political science from the LMU, the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, for his research on EU funds in the post-communist space, and has worked before as a postdoctoral researcher and substitute professor for policy analysis at the Bavarian School of Public Policy in Munich. His areas of interest are post-communist politics, EU enlargement, and renewable energies. And also a warm welcome to Wolf-Achim Wiegand, who will moderate the event. He's a freelance journalist and publishes in the European Forum, the weekly magazine Euractiv, among others. His main themes are international politics, in particular all processes related to the European Union and liberalism. Before I end my usual tip, join the discussion, ask questions via the Q&A button in Zoom, feel free to use it. And now I wish you an exciting and informative web talk, and dear Mr. Wiegand, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for your introduction, Aret Demirci and Konstantin Groth. Hello and good day to everyone, also from me as your moderator. I am very glad that I have very distinguished guests, which I will have questions to in a few moments. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. As you can see, I have to improvise a little bit because we had a technical problem and I'm joining you via handy, via mobile. This doesn't matter because we are fit to improvise, and so everything will be okay. As Mr. Groth also said, all the participants can ask questions. Please write them down in the F&A section below the screen, not in the Q&A, but in the F&A, so not in the chat. I will try to see them and I will see comments and filter them into our conversation as the topic arises. Or if you might like, you can ask the question yourself, but we will see that later. Okay, let's start. Our theme today is Global Europe, Global Expectations, EU Enlargement Scenarios. But I think we cannot explore this without having a look to yesterday's brand new developments in Vilnius in Latvia. Only 24 hours ago, the historic NATO summit has come, and the event is by first sight not directly linked to our theme, the European Union, but the results will have long-lasting effects. And Ukraine has failed to get an accession timeline, but has at least managed to see some security promises. That's at least some progress. But fellow applicant Georgia has got nothing into his hands yesterday. Mrs. Kekenadze, I'm asking you as the first one of both of you. I read in commentaries from Tbilisi today that there is a sense that things for Georgia regarding NATO have changed for the worse. Do you share this view?
Thank you, Mr. Wiegand, for this question. And before I answer it, I would like to use this opportunity and express my gratitude and appreciation to Friedrich-Naumann Office of South Caucasus, who gave me the opportunity to contribute to the publication, and then the Central Office to have an opportunity to be part of this discussion and share light to some of the questions, including the one you mentioned. Indeed, yesterday it was a very important NATO summit in Vilnius, in Lithuania. I have mixed feelings myself. We all, especially in Georgia, expected, at least we hoped, because we are also realists, we hoped that Ukraine, as a country which is in war for more than a year now, would get the clear indication about a NATO membership, which would then be a motivation, a strengthening sign for the people of Ukraine that NATO is standing with the Ukrainian people, and we, Europe, is with them. And unfortunately, it did not happen. I'm happy that some new partnership mechanisms were strengthened in terms of the granting Ukraine NATO Ukraine Council, which will play, of course, a positive role to help Ukraine in different areas, reforms, and so on. When it comes to Georgia, yes, indeed, me, myself, being the part of the process of NATO-Georgia cooperation process, we have long expected some, let's say, positive track on the political dimension of the NATO integration. Even in 2008, I believe people who listen to this podcast, they know that to with Ukraine, Georgia also received promise that the Georgia and NATO would come, we would become the member of NATO when the NATO is ready. And since then, we are expecting when this political readiness among the NATO members would come in realistic. But at the same time, what we see, and that's the homework that we have to be doing on our side, unfortunately, with the current, and that's part of our internal politics, that we see less and less proactive engagement from the current Georgian government in pursuing the membership. So I
let me interrupt you. I would like to ask about the Georgian government. It seems to me that the Georgian government blames the summit outcomes to the West's lack of commitment, as one says.
Well, recently,
how do you see this? Yes, is that true?
Recently, Georgian government blames everything to our Western partners, and that's very unfortunate, and that's very shameful, because almost every Georgian citizen believes that our country belongs in EU and NATO, and entire nation expects that Georgian government does everything proactively to fulfill the direction that the Georgian people expect. But unfortunately, our government is failing, and hopefully next year, when we have the upcoming parliamentary election, Georgian people will speak out, and Georgian people will tell Georgian government that they are failing.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Last question to that complex. Would you go so far to say that the ruling political force in Georgia is deliberately trying to cut the ties to the West?
I would say definitely that at least if you look at their actions, what they have been doing for last couple of years in every way and every direction, this is what we see. And that's not only about the NATO integration, and that also concerns the EU integration. And I believe we will have time to speak about that.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for this voice of Tbilisi. Mr. Hagemann, to you in Munich, Georgia once was one of the most committed NATO applicants. It declares the will to enter since 2 decades now. It's unbelievable, 2 decades. Some saw it even as a tandem with Ukraine, resembling to the actual partnership between Finland and Sweden. What has happened in Tbilisi since the 2008 Bucharest, when the alliance said Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO? What has happened?
First of all, I would also like to thank very much Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for having me and for being part of this panel. Yes, it's difficult to say. As Southeast Europe Association, we're not covering Georgia and Ukraine, but our part is more the Western Balkans and Moldova of this region. And if we look at the region, there was, of course, a very different momentum in 2008. We had a different government in the United States. The EU enlargement was not too far ago, and the recent memory of enlarging any of these organizations was still very close. The last bigger enlargement with Romania and Bulgaria was only in 2007. And I think in what we've seen in general is the development of this kind of enlargement fatigue that has developed in the West, and that Mr. Demirci also kind of touched upon in his opening already. There were a lot of crises the West was dealing with since then. There was the financial and economic crisis, the debt crisis of the South European countries. There was Brexit, Donald Trump, the COVID crisis, the migration crisis, and all types of issues seem to be more important than enlarging organizations. And if we look specifically at NATO for our region, I would say that it's a bit different comparing to Ukraine and Georgia. Because on the one hand, in the Western Balkans, I would say most of the countries who want to be members are already members of the organization. So we have Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia as members. Kosovo, I would say, is also a likely future member. With Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's a very different question. And if we look at Moldova, I would guess that the reception of this is also different than in Ukraine and Georgia, because if you look at the recent polls in Moldova, there is a clear majority support for EU integration and membership in the European Union, but there's also a clear majority against NATO membership, which has been very stable over the past decades. And this might be linked to Moldova's situation as a neutral country, and also it has a very, very small army and always been somewhat between the power blocks. But I would say that the negative signal from Vilnius, if there is any, is from my point of view not too much felt in Chisinau.
Okay, so very different conditions. Let's come to the difficult path of EU enlargement, Mr. Hagemann. You mentioned it already, while Moldova and Ukraine became EU membership candidates, Georgia was left behind and told to come back after fulfilling 12 reform conditions. Could you briefly describe, even if it's not exactly your region, what for EU candidate status, especially on the economic front? I guess it is not little what lacks.
So I think on what lacks for candidate status for Georgia, I would say Tamar is the more qualified person to say. If we look at Moldova and if we try to see what is important for Moldova advancing in the EU process, it's of course a lot, because the country has only recently gained this candidate status, and it was only involved with the European Union within the Eastern Partnership, which doesn't have a very strong depth of integration. It has some experience with the common market as part of the DCFTA, with the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, which had a very good and strong effect on Moldova, basically shifting the level of trade between Russia and the EU from almost 50-50 a decade ago to largely in the favor of the EU. But this is, of course, very far from implementing the entire acquis that you would have to do as a member of the common market. In general, it's difficult to overcome the oligarchic structures of the society, of course. This is still the legacy of the past decades. The government is still working on creating an impartial judiciary, building administrative capacity, and one of the burdens for this is the lack of people who are available for this, because many qualified young people left the country because they didn't see chances for themselves in the past in Moldova. And of course, you also have the Russian military, which is still based in Transnistria, which is a burden. If we look at the positive side, since the change of the government, we see a clear change of media freedom in the country. So we have an advancement since 2021, so only 2 years ago, from place 89 in the global press freedom ranking to 28. So that's a tremendous change. And I think this is very, very important to open up the political space. We had recently this huge pro-EU rally organized by the government in Chisinau. And also, as I said, the surveys that clearly show a majority for EU integration. And this is also backed up by things the EU does now, which it didn't do in the past, and especially not before the start of the war. So we have increased financial support. We have a mission together with the EU to fight hybrid threats against, so basically looking on Russia that will be opened. And we also have support from the EU to disentangle Moldova from Russia's energy grip, which has been misused very often in the past. So Moldova is, I think, since the beginning of this year, able to work independently without Russian gas flows. And this was unthinkable only a year or 2 years ago. So this is a great support. And in this way, things are moving into a very good direction.
Well, I see some similarities to Georgia, Mrs. Kekenadze. Mr. Hagemann spoke about people leaving the country. I think that's the same problem in Georgia, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. I can also see the resemblance to the reflection concerning Moldova. Yes, people are leaving, and we see that compared to the last years, the number increases because people lost hope. And no matter the difficulties and economic difficulties, Georgians are very optimistic people, and we are used to fighting, and we are used to fighting for our freedoms and for our right to be back part as a European family. But they see that time goes and our government is failing to deliver, and that concerns the EU integration as well. And as you rightly mentioned, we failed to get the candidacy status. Unfortunately, and I mentioned it in one of my articles last year, when we could not receive the status, that was a mistake from the side of the EU. I understood, and that was one of the justification was that not giving the candidacy status to Georgia and giving the 12, let's say, homeworks to deliver would help Georgia political spectrum to be less polarized and to find the kind of way to work together. But that created more divisions. And recently we had interim kind of assessment from the European Union side, and they saw themselves that we only have hardly 3 out of 12 points met. So this means that there is hardly any prospect for our government fulfilling these 12 commitments, and we knew it from the beginning. So in my understanding, and maybe I'm too critical at this point, that was the kind of homework that you knew that this government would not be able to fulfill. So having this perspective and having election next year, I think now European Union will be very considerate how to deal with this case, because the decision can be the either or decision, both ways can be then used as a political instrument during the election campaign. And knowing the careful decision making in Brussels, I don't expect any ready solutions to that. I'm still hopeful that we will get a candidacy status and Ukraine and Moldova will advance, especially as I mentioned in regards to Ukraine, country which is in war and which is in war with Russia, and they are fighting not only their fight, but they are fighting Georgians' fight and everyone's fight. So I think we should be able, it's our moral obligation to help them as much as we can.
Well, let's speak about the elections later once more. On the first side, Mrs. Kekenadze, I see another similarity between Georgia and Moldova. We know that support in your country, support for EU integration is consistently high in Georgia. It's even enshrined in the constitution. And government actions like the attempt to pass foreign agents legislation tailored to the Russian model has led to massive protests against the ruling party earlier this year. I just would like to know what has happened to this legislation. Is it still on the table?
It's still on the table because government understood that they cannot play with the Georgian people's will. In the beginning, when they started introducing this bill, they thought that it could pass, that the Georgian people would not protest, but they don't know their own people. I mean, you mentioned yourself that Georgian people consistently in the survey show that for them and for us, EU and NATO integration is something we strongly believe in, and for us it's an existential, it's a way to overcome all the existential threats that we as a country face. But as with every other action, Georgian government misread the people's will, and I'm really happy that Georgian people spoke, and there was a huge protest, and that was one of the very important decisions that the Georgian people forced government to withdraw this bill. And since then, although there were some, let's say, inside rumors that maybe during the summer, because summer usually is a quiet period in terms of political turmoil in Georgia, that they would dare to bring it back. But now we see that they clearly got the message from the Georgian people. But then there are some other aspects, maybe we can come back to that later, how they treat the minorities in this country. And
yes, let's come back to that.
Last week, okay.
Let's come back to that. Mr. Hagemann, what about other countries willing to join the EU? I know that, of course, each country has its individual approach and individual challenges, but do you see parallels to the Georgian or Moldovan situation elsewhere?
Well, I think there are a lot of parallels and, of course, also lessons that could be drawn from the experience, especially of the Western Balkan states in the past decade or so. So one thing is probably the observation that migration is a huge problem for the entire region. And there's somehow a saying in the region that people state, if the EU doesn't come to us, we will come to the EU. So if my country doesn't become an EU member, I will become individually an EU member. And a lot of people have done this already. Taking, for example, the people from Moldova who are able to apply for Romanian citizenship. They have become individual members and they are now EU citizens and citizens of Moldova, including the president. She's also an EU citizen. And similar things for other countries of the region.
Lucky for Moldova. Lucky for Moldova.
Yes, I think Ms. Sandu is also the most popular politician in Romania, so this also says something. Another important thing that I tend to hear a lot is like judging the past decade of the enlargement process, that they say the countries pretended to conduct EU reforms and the EU pretended to actually want them as members. And I think this is very important to understand what it means, because EU enlargement is both about credibility and accountability, and both of them were lacking. So credibility, that you can actually become a member of the EU if you fulfill the criteria, that was lacking because the EU was not really interested in accepting further members, leading to a statement by Jean-Claude Juncker at some point where he said, okay, we will not have another enlargement until 2025, I think it was at that point, which was completely demotivating. But on the other hand, also accountability was lacking. So we have a situation where Freedom House says that you have the biggest democratic backsliding in Montenegro and Serbia between 2017 and 2021. But these are the two countries who are the front runners of the EU enlargement process at this point. So a complete decoupling of being a front runner and fulfilling EU demands for accession, underlining at the same time that enlargement was not really expected also from the EU side. And I would say that it took Russia's war to remind a lot of people that finalizing the European project is actually important, and that it is not only based on fulfilling promises or that it is based on values, but it's also strongly in our interest.
Mr. Hagemann, you spoke about the enthusiasm in Moldova for the European Union. Is that the case also in other Eastern European countries?
Yeah,
I mean,
well, that depends on who you ask. So if you look at the surveys from the Regional Cooperation Council, which is an organization that brings together all Western Balkan countries, or 6 Western Balkan countries in the Berlin process, they do regional-wide surveys, and they find that a majority of citizens of the Western Balkans is positive towards EU enlargement and wants their countries to join the EU. The thing is a bit more tricky in Serbia because the majority is always very shallow, and it's somewhat between 40 and maximum 50% there. If you look at what people do, I think this is even more telling, and this is then also clear for Serbia, because the people who migrate in great numbers, they go to the EU. They don't go to Moscow and they don't go to Beijing. So the way of life they are looking for is actually a European way of life, even if they are sometimes not so amazed about the EU because it didn't fulfill its promises in the past. And what we have seen in some places, for example, I think North Macedonia is the worst example. The EU has very much shattered its credibility because the country fulfilled its obligations from the side of the EU, even though they were, they were hardly justified by the EU standards for accession. Let's put it mildly that way. They still fulfilled it, but they didn't get anything in return because of bilateral blocks from other countries, and this has not really been resolved until now. And this is, of course, something that has a very, very negative effect on the European enthusiasm. But after all, as a final sentence, I would say that the EU is the #1 player in the region. So if the EU wants the region to join, the people will want to join the EU, but they also don't want to be left behind. And I think this is also very interesting in the Moldova surveys, because Moldova is only getting now this attention. And this is like 60% of people would join the EU, but there's also about like 40% would potentially also join an Eurasian Economic Union, but they would prefer the EU, but they understand we have to join something because we don't want to be left behind and as a country out in the cold. I think if the EU makes good offers, it can spur enthusiasm, and we see this with the demonstrations, not only in Tbilisi, but also in Chisinau, and recently also in Belgrade again.
Let me ask you, Mr. Hagemann, what would you say, is the will to join the European Union, is it just an emotional matter, or do people really know what being EU member really means? I remind you to the words of the British Minister of Defense at the Vilnius meeting yesterday. He urged the Ukrainian government to be more thankful to the allied nations, and he has said that NATO is no delivery shop like Amazon. Are you sure that EU membership is not only understood as an economic safe haven, but also as a community of values and obligations?
The knowledge of the EU is of course an important aspect, and I think this is very interesting because if we look at the survey a bit more closely, then you see the countries farthest from EU membership are the ones who like the EU most and who are most optimistic about joining very, very soon. Like in Kosovo, 90% of people support membership, and most of them think it will happen in the coming years, even though the other countries have made this very frustrating experience. So I think the knowledge of what it means to be an EU member is most likely not very big among the population, but I think the benefits of it are pretty clear. And many of the people who are there have experience of living in the EU, in EU countries, or working there. So they have seen something they want for themselves. And I think if you look at the countries of the 2004 and 2007 enlargement, you see that there were also, to different degrees, there was a necessity for some socialization effects of the countries. So some countries developed in a much more difficult way, like Hungary, or also more recently Poland, that made it very, very difficult to work and deal with them. But other countries that were expected to fail, let's put it bluntly like this, like Romania, they developed in a very good direction, I would say. It's far from perfect there, but against the backdrop of the expectations, the country is now, it was in 1999, Romania was as poor as Bosnia is now. Now they are richer than Greece and approaching Poland slowly. So things are moving, and we should also look at these bright sides from time to time. And I think what it means to be a member, I remember the Romanian EU Council presidency. Unfortunately, it happened during the period of a very corrupt government, and not too much happened during this period. But also the EU was not destroyed. Actually, Brexit and other issues were much deeper problems during that time, and nobody would have expected this from the UK or other countries. So we should not be too afraid of things that can happen, because there are not too many signs of the past that this is naturally the case.
Let me press you also, Mrs. Kekenadze. Do the Georgian people really understand that EU membership means obligations, which can be sometimes also burdens, like, for example, financial stability?
Well, if I'm honest, I don't believe that every single Georgian understands what EU all about. I don't think that even every single EU citizen understands what EU all about, but we clearly can compare what it means to have the neighbor who tries to take all your liberties and your choice of freedom to choose your own independence, your way of living, and so on, and have neighbors who value human rights, who value dignity of each and every individual. So basic, and if you compare the standards of the living, what is in the EU member states, and our citizens were able to see it since we got the visa liberalization. So in recent years, many youngsters are now able to travel freely to the European Union countries, and they themselves see what are the benefits of being part of the European Union. We, since the independence of Georgia, we see all the development that's happening in different areas, starting from the infrastructure to education to culture to all the horizontally to all the areas, that this is a support that we are getting from the European Union and our other strategic partner. And what's the alternative? For Georgians, the alternative is being still under the, if not EU, then it's Russia. And you know that since 2008 war, Russia is continuing to occupy 20% of our territories. And we all know what's happening in terms of human rights in these territories and so on. So it's very easy to make this choice, whether we as Georgian people want to be members of the EU or not. During the Brexit times, when UK decided to leave the European Union, you would hear Georgian citizens joking that we would gladly exchange the place with the UK. So overall, maybe not everyone understands what are the responsibilities being the European Union member, but every Georgian citizen clearly understands what is it if we don't join the European Union.
Mr. Hagemann, I think you are the right person to explain us what are the overall reasons for the delays in the enlargement process in the past decade.
Well, there are different reasons. I think several of which have been touched upon already. It's like this entire enlargement fatigue conundrum, that there were other crises to deal with. But this is, of course, should not mean that there are not also problems which are based in the region. And this is what many researchers call for the Western Balkans, the development of so-called stabilitocracy in the region. This basically refers to a development of a type of authoritarian government which centralizes control over the institutions, mostly based on a ruling party, using state capture, the use of state resources for its own preservance of power, centralizing control over the media, and signaling to the EU that it's governing somehow with a stable hand and that it offers stability, but at the same time creating instability itself, only to resolve these crises then, and to look like somehow a stable partner, but being in reality the source of the original source of the problems. And this is what was criticized about the European Union for a very long time, and is still criticized, that it cooperates with these authoritarian governments in the region, and sometimes even applauds them for their so-called progress on the road to EU enlargement, even though the leaders usually don't really have an intention of really approaching the EU and really changing the status quo situation, because it seems to be very well in their interest of power preserving. So the problem is somewhat that this situation became very entrenched in many countries of the region. And I think the only group that did not give up on enlargement, especially in the Western Balkans, but also in Moldova, that were the citizens. Because every now and then, even though elections were not fair anymore, even though you could not hold your government accountable and vote another pro-EU government in, at some point, if things got too bad, the citizens would take to the streets and sometimes even manage to kick the government out and to get another government in. And the EU was not really good in seizing these opportunities. Just to quote again the example of North Macedonia, it was exactly this. There was a government that was more and more authoritarian. Then the EU cooperated well with it and continued to say, okay, we can open accession negotiations if it was not only for Greece. And then suddenly an eavesdropping scandal erupted. So the government was eavesdropping on about 20,000 people in public life, journalists, politicians. And what resulted was a huge state crisis and a 2-year power fight that included also the storming of the parliament, pretty much like in Washington, D.C., what we've seen 2 or 3 years ago. And after all of this, the EU did a good job in supporting the country and changing the government and making it all as peaceful as possible. But then there was no progress for North Macedonia. There was, even though there was the historic Prespa agreement that resolved the name dispute, they could not open the accession negotiations. And I think if this had turned out differently, then probably also the dynamic would be differently, because from my point of view, what the EU needs in the region is a front runner that really deserves the name. And if other countries would see this, if the citizens of other countries would see this, they would ask, why don't we have this progress if they got progress on a meritocratic basis? But as they failed it, now the more authoritarian government can tell their citizens, okay, look at the EU, it's only telling you lies. They're making false promises. And they won't let you into the EU anyway because they don't want to. And I think this is the huge problem of credibility that both stops the candidate countries in making these reforms and citizens really believing in that they might happen and probably supporting more reformist governments.
So let us take for a moment Brussels in the focus. And I have a question here from a participant, from Mr. Jörn Eichhorn, and I read it to you. I think it's a question to both of you. How would you comment on the fact that the 2023 Strategic Foresight Report of the EU didn't even mention the word enlargement? Additionally, the cooperation with the EU neighboring countries is barely mentioned in the report. Who wants to answer first?
Well, I can try, at least from our perspective. Well, unfortunately, those types of actions or inactions does not really help, especially forces like myself or our liberal forces, let me put this way, and advocates of the EU integration to continue pushing for the support of European integration agenda, especially when we see growing involvement, and that involvement grows daily from the side of Russian propaganda and all the anti-liberal propaganda that we hear. But nevertheless, the facts that you, Mr. Wiegand, mentioned yourself about the Georgia's protests as soon as the Georgian government tried to derail from the EU integration path, or even made a question mark, really gives me the hope that no matter what the bureaucrats in Brussels may or not put in the report, that this cooperation, the partnerships, and Georgian people's aspiration to be part of the European family will not suffer. Thank you.
Mr. Hagemann, your answer about the fact that the word enlargement is not mentioned anymore in the EU report.
Yeah, I think this. I don't know anything. I don't have any background information on this, but I can only guess. But I would say, on the one hand, it surely reflects the weakness of the enlargement department in the European Commission, which is handled by Russia currently, and where there are a lot of vacancies also. So it's and as you know, Hungary is advocating. Hungary is advocating for EU accession without criteria. So the road is a bit clear how the policy would look like if they would get their way. I would say it also reflects a lack of cohesion among the member states, because this is also at the heart of the problem of the credibility, that there's not really unity on these issues, that there are still member states who are critical about enlargement and who also from time to time block it. I think the position of France has changed a bit in the past, which is very important. And Macron has somewhat answered to Scholz's Prague speech in his Bratislava speech, being much more positive towards Eastern and Southeast Europe. But still, it doesn't seem to me that it's really like the #1 issue among the member states, and one that creates unity. And finally, I also think that it's shocking that it's not mentioned, because this Foresight report is also about strategic autonomy. And the idea of the European Union being an autonomous actor and having a successful foreign policy on its own, I think, is very much decided in the region, because I think you could turn Frank Sinatra's statement around and by saying, if you can't make it there, you make it nowhere, because there nowhere the situation is so beneficial for the European Union to act in foreign policy like in the Western Balkans and in the Western post-Soviet space. And if this is not an area where the EU can succeed, how should it succeed in Asia or in Latin America or Africa? So I think this is a problem the EU still has to work on, that the focus on the region, like in the past, it has been very much centered on like a Central European interest. In the first round, especially Germany, who was advocating for enlargement, and some other member states a bit wary of it, that it's in the interest of the entire European Union to do this.
Well, I mean, we were speaking already about the enlargement fatigue, and I have the feeling that the European Commission is not as enthusiastic about enlargement as before. Can it be that Brussels is too much occupied with bigger issues? I think about the decline of worldwide influence. I think about the economic competition with auto. I think about the competition with the United States industrial policy, and also not to mention the Russian challenge and huge efforts for the European countries in arms and defense. Can it be that the EU, can the EU afford to assimilate more newcomers to its club of 28? What do you think? What is what is going on in the brains of the Brussels bureaucrats, as you said? I would say the Brussels politicians. A question to both of you. What's your perspective about the European Commission enthusiasm in Brussels for enlargement? Two big problems.
Well, I cannot say what's going on in the minds of the Brussels bureaucrats, but what I know for sure, especially in the contents of Russia, and you yourself very well put it, I think at least since the war in Ukraine, it has to be clear that unless there is a clarity on the enlargement on the eastern part, and unless there is a clarity how EU handles those nations who aspire to become the European Union members, which are part of the Europe, I think what Brussels bureaucrats might be missing to, I don't want to use the word understand. I think they clearly understand everything, but at least I think they are still struggling to believe and see clearly that avoiding enlargement does not help even to solve those questions that you just very clearly outlined. And I honestly believe that the war in Ukraine, which is unfortunate that we need to face such tragedies to make sure that the countries who share the same values would start finally to clearly see what is it Russia and what is Kremlin and what it wants. And if we all agree that there should not be autocracies, at least on the European ground, and I won't go in the other regions, then enlargement is a tool that EU has to clearly show to Russia, to Putin, that the way they are handling the politics, the way of handling the sovereign right of other countries to decide themselves where they want to go, then and if this clarity is not achieved as soon as possible, then the Russia is winning, and the war is not only lost on the ground fields. The wars are lost in the minds and souls of the people.
What would you say, Mrs. Kekenadze? How can the European Union help the willing countries? I mean, especially helping not to fall further into Russia's sphere of influence.
We need clarity, and maybe I'm repeating myself that we, when I say we, I mean Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. We need clarity of the integration path. Our government, our people, and I guess the same is for Ukraine especially, and the Moldova as well, especially in the terms of the European integration, that we need the clear path. So what should be done from our side, and then how European Union will assess it. And when they give us the 12 points, or whether it will some other homework, that they clearly understand what they expect from the government side, because it's government who should be delivering these points. And when, for example, and I will come back to the point of how Georgian government is treating the minorities, that they don't allow the basic constitutional right of gathering to the LGBTQI representatives. And this is not just an individual case. That has been a problem for many years now. And like for some years ago, on July 5th, there was a violent, the rally was disassembled, and we had the journalists beaten, and one of them died, and there has not been any investigation. And we need a clear response from the European side on that, and the Georgian people should be seeing that when it comes to the human rights, when it comes to the freedoms and fighting for freedoms, that European Union has the clear answer when these freedoms are not met.
Let me ask you about this incident at the Pride celebration outside of Tbilisi. Who was behind those attacks against the LGBTQ community?
Well, formally, it was a far-right group, but everyone in this country knows that those groups could not do anything unless they knew that the government would not budge, and that these groups and their activities are informally supported by the Georgian government, because this is not a big group, and I believe in all the countries are some minorities, I mean the far right, but in those countries the government has the legitimacy and has the means and has the will to protect the other citizens. And in Georgian case, we see over and over the Georgian Dream government fails to protect the minorities. And when we look at the comments that the government representatives make, they encourage far-right groups and other violent groups to attack people who think differently and who just basically want to exercise their constitutional rights.
Well, to you, Mr. Hagemann, the same question. How can the European Union help the willing countries? What should the European Union do, or what can it do?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to underline the point that Tamar just made, the clarity of integration. I think this is very important because this created also for the Central Eastern European enlargement round the basis for a national consensus on EU enlargement. So what you saw in the region was that there were governments competing on who would do EU enlargement best, and they would alternate in power. What you see currently is that not only democracy is declining, but also there's no more real change of power in many countries. And in some countries, there's also a lack of a second camp that could actually take power. So this is a huge problem. And the EU could, if it would offer a credible road to membership, offer a basis for such a national consensus that would help to form the national debate and would also make it easier for citizens to determine who works actually for their future and who doesn't and who fails to fulfill the promises. I think there's a lot of debate about policy. And there are different proposals, if there could be a staged accession model, so getting earlier to the cohesion funds, for example, or getting speaking rights at the council before you get member and have no voting rights. There's a discussion about more funds or including the countries entirely into the process of cohesion policy and thereby giving them more money. These are interesting discussions, and some of the topics might actually work, also including them into the common market. But I think the biggest thing is about politics, because politics has hindered the countries from entering the European Union. And these are these bilateral disputes that led to the blocks for the accession process of countries. And there must be unity created within the European Union. And in this way, the countries can be more successful, because if they don't believe in the process, then even the governments who want to make progress will have a difficulty to implementing the reforms. Maybe just to pick up on the question, if the European Commission is somehow bored by enlargement, or rather deals with other issues which are more important currently. For example, the competition with external actors like China or Russia. I think this underlines that many of the issues the EU is dealing with are actually linked to the region, because they are the same issues in the region, or because they actually in a way stem also from there. I think one issue is the one of changing economic policies, like change in globalization, having shorter production chains. This, of course, brings in the economies of the region, because much outsourcing that has been done to other places could also go there in the future. If you look at the competition with external actors, if we do not realize that these countries are a field of competition, and not only the Western post-Soviet space where Russia has declared open war, but also the Western Balkans, then the countries like China and Russia have already realized this. For China, China is investing. China has the 17+1 initiative. Some of you might have heard of. So this includes all Central Eastern European and Southeast European countries. Now it's only 14+1 because the Baltics have exited it by now. But It's a wide region, but half of the money that goes there for infrastructure from the Belt and Road Initiative goes to the Western Balkans. So this shows that China wants to leave a footprint in the region, and the Western Balkans have an economy of the size of Slovakia. So it's pretty small, but still the money is going there, and sometimes also putting a burden on the countries. For example, Montenegro almost defaulted because it could not pay its debt for a highway project. And these problems will eventually lead again to instability the EU will have to deal with. And if you leave these countries in the so-called gray zone, where you have instability, authoritarian governance, and state capture, they will always be very open to authoritarian influences from outside, but also to developments leading to instability that you can't predict by now, but that will happen. For example, if you remember this very cynical idea of the Belarusian president Lukashenko to get migrants to Minsk and carry them to the Polish border to pressure the European Union. I think this is a very good example of what happens if you have authoritarian leaders in the region who don't really care about the development of their countries and their relationship to the EU and what they might do, only to pressure the European Union. So it's clearly in the interest of us to advance in these areas.
I believe Mr. Wiegand has technical difficulties.
Yeah, it seems he's frozen.
Dear Konstantin, are you there? It seems to be that Mr. Wiegand is frozen.
I see it. He told us 1 moment. He lost power. It takes a moment to restore. So I have to wait for him. Perhaps I can ask our technical service, Maximilian Schlesinger.
Yeah.
Do you have contact with Mr. Wiegand?
He's working on it. He wrote to me, and he needs some. He lost the power on his phone, but he's still here with the computer.
Okay.
And
maybe we could have a few questions from the audience. If you can write them, we could take them in the meantime.
There's a question from the audience. How would you comment on the fact?
We had that already, yeah.
Okay. We had that. We have a new question. I can read it. What would you both see as a good first next step to accession to the EU for Georgia, a little one perhaps? Ms. Kekenadze,
yes, can I respond? So I guess the first small step and very highly anticipated would be the granting Georgia the anticipated candidacy status. And this is something that I believe would serve as a boost for Georgian people to continue the fight for its freedoms, and no matter what type of the government we have right now, and that would serve as a very good incentive for Georgian people to make sure that when they see the government is not delivering, and then I mentioned it that the next year in 2024 fall, we have a parliamentary election, so that the Georgian people take the actions in their hands and make sure that there is a new government in place who will be able to continue better the EU integration path.
Mr. Hagemann? Next step for Georgia, and Mr. Wiegand is back. Great.
Yeah, I think
you're
I
still
have...
muted. You're still muted, Mr. Wiegand. You have to unmute. Now, yes. But we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I hope it's not with an echo. It's clear for you.
We have a little echo.
That's my problem as well. Wait a moment. It could be. No, it's not better, isn't it?
No, it's good
it's
now.
better now. Yes, it's good.
It's
Please
better.
proceed.
You can continue.
Okay. Well, I have a small echo. So excuse me if I wait a little bit after I heard your answers. This is very interesting. I have done so many years radio. Do you still hear me?
Yes.
You hear me? Okay.
Yes, clearly.
So I hope that I will hear you too, because my screen is black again. Well, that's life. And life would be not so funny if things like that would not happen. Where have we been? We have. I have asked you when I was thrown out if the European Commission seems to have lack enthusiasm about the enlargement because of the many problems the EU has to solve in this moment. And we were exploring about that and what the European Union should and could do to help the willing the countries who are willing to join the enlargement. And I think these answers were not completed. So I ask you about that. What should the European Commission do?
I think we're through with that. We continue talking for a while.
Yes, yes, I think we covered that safely.
We lost Mr. Wiegand again.
Perhaps if you can hear us, Mr. Wiegand, if you can hear us, perhaps you could make it just with your computer without your mobile, so we can see you, but we will hear you.
Konstantin, maybe I can ask a question to Mr. Hagemann,
of course.
While we are waiting for Mr.
Yes.
Wiegand. I mean, there are still some unresolved problems in the Western Balkans, especially, I mean, between Kosovo and Serbia. And how do you see the chance of Kosovo one day being, I mean, a member of the European Union, as long as these problems are not solved? And I mean, not all European Union member states have recognized Kosovo as an independent state. And then, I mean, in the past, we also have seen the example of Cyprus, where, I mean, the Republic of Cyprus became a member of the European Union, while there's a de facto state in the north, which is not recognized except for Turkey. But this is not a leverage at all to solve the Cyprus problem, or it came out that this was not a leverage. How do you see this in the Western Balkans, especially when it comes to Kosovo?
Yeah, that's thank you for the question. It's interesting that the first time I heard people comparing Cyprus to another country, it was from the Moldovans, when they said in the past, okay, we don't necessarily have to resolve the dispute before becoming a member state. So this should not hold us from this. But I think from the EU point of view, this is of course not an ideal position. And I think also not from the point of view of the German government, most likely, as the policy used always to be that you have to resolve these disputes first. When it comes to Serbia and Kosovo, it's especially difficult because both countries would become, or could potentially become independently of each other, members of the EU, but still most likely in a tandem, because many people also say if they don't join together, then there might be a higher chance of bilateral blocks again among the countries. But of course, they are at very different positions in the enlargement process. I'm not so sure what the effect is of the non-recognizers within the European Union, because what I heard from one of these countries, for example, is that they said, as soon as Serbia accepts this, then we will also accept it. And I think this is a matter that, because the main fear is that this precedence of some territory splitting off without the original state agreeing would also probably apply to your country. It's not important anymore as soon as the country agrees that they split off. So I think this could be in such a way most likely be overcome. But currently, it's very difficult to see any progress. Even we have seen in the past weeks developments in the opposite direction, I would say. We've had these roadblocks, this violence, and at some point the appearance that there could be potentially a deal, but backtracking shortly afterwards. I would say it's currently very difficult to see progress, and I would also put the question, who's actually interested in progress here? And I would say for some actors, it's a very pleasant situation with the status quo, because you can blame everything on this single issue and you don't have to deal with the other issues. And this makes negotiations, of course, difficult, because if the sides don't really have an incentive to agree, this won't lead so far. I think a good comparison is the Prespa agreement, where the North Macedonian side had a very high incentive to agree. And on the other side, the Greek government at least lacked a disincentive to agree. So it was a left government. It didn't have to take care so much of the nationalist vote. It was shortly before the end of its legislative period. And even though the government broke down because of the Prespa agreement, which is often forgot, and it paid a price for making this, it was only a couple of weeks before the elections. So it wasn't such a big problem. And we are far from such a situation with Serbia, Kosovo now.
Thank you so much. Maybe this is also similar when it comes to Albania and Greece, because we are currently working on a project which is dealing with the bilateral relation between these two countries. And there was a huge process.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you, Mr. Wiegand. You don't hear us? I was saying there was a huge development, but then I think a politician of Greek origin in Albania was arrested, and this immediately, had a bad impact on the bilateral relations. So it's then again from the beginning. So all these great developments of the past maybe 2 years, they were just falling apart immediately. So
can I ask a question to Tamar about Georgia? Because I found it very interesting that there's such a strong reference in Tbilisi to the European Union. Because if you look at Minsk, for example, they also had huge demonstrations in the past, and of course they are much closer to Russia. But in Minsk, it was mostly national issues. So they always had this white and red flag carried around, but you could barely see a new flag anywhere. So where does the strong reference to the European Union come from when you criticize the pro-Russian government? Why is it not more about independence or national sovereignty or something like this?
So I don't hear anything.
Okay. Okay, I'll try.
Do you hear me? I
Yes.
mean, this doesn't help really.
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Wiegand. And I will try to answer that. Well, from my and Georgian's perspective, the realities with the Belarus and Georgia cannot be compared for many reasons, and it's, I guess, the very lengthy discussion. But I guess the why you see such a strong, let's say, feelings, I will use this word, in Georgia towards the EU integration, and I might be repeating myself.
No.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, strange. Really strange. So continue.
Sorry. Yes, I'm trying to answer Mr. Hegemann's question. There are a number of reasons, historic reasons, because we Georgians always believed and always identified ourselves as the part of the Europe. And even 100 years ago, when the Georgia first got the independence, that was one of the driving forces for that fight again against Russia and at that time Russian Empire. And then even that time, the main, let's say, the backbone of the fight was again the same belief that we don't belong under the Russian influence, and we belong in Europe. And there is this sentiment that when you talk about the European integration, we always, even the wording is that we want to go back to the European family. And it's not only the words, it's the sentiments behind it, the emotions behind it. And that's why it's not only the attributes that you see in Tbilisi and all over the countries. It's just very conscious understanding that unless we are part of the European family with where we belong, with the same values, same attitudes, then the Russia will follow us. And that's why for us it's an existential question, and that concerns both European Union and NATO as well.
I have a question to Mr. Hagemann. We are now talking about the population in the countries which want to join the European Union. Let us talk about the population within the European Union. Isn't it true that we, the EU citizens, are not very well informed about those countries who want to join us? I mean, if I see on the streets, if I speak to people here in Germany or in other countries, they don't even know where Georgia is. They don't know what Moldova is. Isn't that a lack also, that we do not make enough efforts to understand these countries, to promote these cultures, to have more information about the people? What do you think?
That's definitely an important point, and I think this should also go along with like a new enlargement strategy that puts more emphasis on actually finalizing the project. And I think it is already on its way, because it doesn't always need central state planning to achieve this. For example, if I look at Upper Bavaria, where we are based, the biggest group of foreigners there, so people with foreign passports, are Romanians. And this is only a development of the past 5 to 10 years. It hasn't been like this before. Before there was, it's still a very big Croat community, many Greeks there from Southeast Europe. So you see this now, that you, for example, have Romanian restaurants, which you didn't have in the past. and ways to explore this culture that you probably had not the possibility to encounter before. And I think this slowly moves eastwards and southwards in a way. If you look, I don't know, at the government level, for example, in Moldova, the first minister from Germany who would visit Moldova was Guido Westerwelle in 2010, so 20 years after independence. So a complete neglect. Also, the government didn't know where Moldova was, apparently. But what you have now is that in 2 years' time, the chancellor visited Moldova, the foreign minister visited Moldova, and the country held the European Political Community Summit only recently. This was the biggest event in the country's history that was hosted by Moldova, and it was given deliberately to Chisinau to show a signal of political support. It was a lot in the news, and I think people are also somewhat familiarizing with the faces of the politicians, like Maya Sandu from the region. I think this is a slow process, and what also helps is that migration is a big factor, that people also encounter the people. And if I look around here, like 10 or 15 years ago, the vans that were driving around of many people working here, they had Polish names on it or Hungarian names, and now there are more and more Albanian names, for example. So there's a lot of exchange, especially in Germany, with the region, and meeting people from the region, often probably without knowing really that they do. And a famous example is that almost all Italian restaurants in Berlin are run by Albanians, but people normally don't know that they're run by Albanians. But I think it would be good if there was more advocacy for this in general, because what you see now is that there is still awareness of enlargement, and that many people are skeptical, and there are many open questions, of course, and these questions have to be answered. And this is, of course, something that is also our job as Southeast Europe Association, as we are like one of the first contact points of people who want to learn something about the region and get information and get in touch. But we are a bit, I don't know, get, of course, a very positive image, because the people who come to us, they are already interested in the region. But I would say that we see that the interest has definitely increased, and also to circles where you probably wouldn't have expected it before.
Allow me a little remark, which is not meant very seriously. Here in Hamburg, the red light district is also run by the Albanians from Kosovo. But this is not seriously meant. What I really want to ask is, what role can tourism play in this circumstances? For example, I heard that Georgia is now a very interesting hotspot, especially for backpackers from Germany. And so tourism brings people together, and people experience what goes on in the country. They learn by traveling, they learn about the culture, about the food and everything. What is your experience in Georgia with tourism?
Well, indeed, before the COVID, especially in the mountainous regions, we would have mostly tourists from the western part of the European Union, and that was very good for our development and also developing the touristic sites and so on. On the one hand, the COVID really killed, let me see this way, this turnout of the tourists, but the biggest difficulties that we are now facing is that since the war started in Ukraine, we see more Russians fleeing. In the beginning of the war, we would have more Russians coming to Georgia, then some of them left. But even now, if you would go to the Black Sea region of Georgia, which is one of the highest tourist destinations with a high demand, and even in the mountain regions, you would see more and more Russian tourists. And we hear, and it's written all over the social media and different blogs, that because of that, we have a cancellation from the Baltic state, from other European states, because there is a perception that in the places where the Russian tourists go, it's not worth going. So we see this decline in the Western, from the side of the tourists from the Western countries. And when I listen to the representatives of tourist agencies and businesses, this is one of their main concerns. Of course, our own touristic small boutique hotels that not only them, but like small houses that are being used as hotels, you would see a very clear indication from their side that they don't want to see Russian tourists, because it's a political tourism for us, and there is a very open, clear message from those population that Russia is an occupant and we don't want to see Russian tourists. But the reality is as it is, and it really has an effect on having more high-end tourists, and that affects the entire industry.
But may I ask, so it's still possible for Russians to cross the border and to make holidays in Georgia?
Yes, it's open. We don't have visa with them.
You don't, so and you don't have sanctions. Georgia has no sanctions.
Yes, we
okay.
That's our government's policy, another policy that many of the Georgians don't agree.
Yeah, I see. Just to understand that, you have also an influx of Russians who say that they left the country because of the war. What about them? Some say it is shaky with these people.
Well, you never know whether that's an excuse to have to expect the warm welcome for the Georgian side. Of course, there are a number of Russian citizens who are in minority, who are for liberal minding and who are trying to fight for, against the Putin regime. So, and of course, these people are warmly welcome in Georgia. But as I said, the biggest influx is just from the ordinary Russians who cannot go and travel in many European countries because of the visa ban and so on. And they see that there's a safe haven in Georgia because there's no visa restriction and the borders are open.
Okay, I was reminded that we are not over the moon, but we are over the time. And so I would like to give you both the possibility to have last words. I think we had a very interesting insight today. Even I don't know what you were talking about during the blackout, but I hope it was interesting also for the participants. But now, if you want to say something which wasn't mentioned, you have the opportunity. Who wants to start, Mr. Hagemann or Mrs. Kekenadze?
Maybe I will just follow up and,
okay.
I'm really thankful for this opportunity. Indeed, it was very interesting discussion, and I'm thankful for the chance about talking about Georgia EU integration and about the importance of European Union's better clarity on the integration processes and how that influence not only the Georgia but all the Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. And I am really very thankful to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, who continues to fight for the liberal values and who is, I would say, I think the only organization, at least on the Georgian side, that really supported to the liberal parties, liberal NGOs and liberal-minded organizations, including LGBTQI representatives, because the situation in terms of supporting the freedoms is really diminishing, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation's existence in this country and in this region is very important, and I'm really thankful for that.
Mr. Hagemann.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, in general, for this opportunity to participate in this interesting discussion. I would probably, for the end, try to underline something positive. And I think one thing is that this narrative of doing their homework for the countries is just too limited, because also the EU hasn't done its homework in a lot of cases, and we should look at both sides. And I always like to draw people to the miracles in the region that we have seen. And we have already touched upon the positive developments in Romania. We've talked about the PRESPA agreement. And maybe a final one I would like to draw attention to is the election of Maia Sandu and the PAS government in the past years. Because this is one of the poorest countries in Europe, where really everybody can use a little extra money that is offered from cheap gas from Russia or something like this. But nevertheless, people decided that they are fed up with their politics. They are fed up with politicians doing state capture, and elected a politician that stood mostly for integrity in the fight against corruption. And I think this is something that is not only a huge source of inspiration, but that should also let people reconsider. If you look at our polls currently in Germany, if you see which parties get support in times of crisis, and rethink how you can deal with problems, and what is also a different way of dealing with it, and what kind of lessons you can also draw from the region.
Thank you. Well, we have reached the end of our talk, and I don't see any further questions from the audience, only a remark by Gerhard Wagner, who says one should look also to, as he says, non-functional countries as Serbia, Bosnia, or Kosovo. I know there are many more items which we could touch, but the time is over. Let me say thank you to you both, Tamar Kekenadze in Tbilisi, and to you, Christian Hagemann in Munich. You both have enriched our meeting with valuable insider informations. Your work on the path towards a bigger and more united Europe is difficult, I know, and it is complicated. And in this respect, I say goodbye to you with gratitude and wish you every success with your foundations and your society. Also, thank you to all of you, the participants at home or wherever you have watched and listened. Thanks to those who have watched this event on YouTube as well. And thanks to the technical supporters. I have to find out myself the miracle of the problems I had. And last but not least, my thanks also go to the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung für die Freiheit and the Thomas Dehler Stiftung for providing the platform and for trusting me. Have a good day and stay safe. I say goodbye, auf Wiedersehen, and in Georgian, nach man dies, if I pronounce it.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.